screen behind me, or do you see
Yes.
my actual slides?
Like, well, I see the slide up, but then down in the little pictures, I just see a black screen behind you.
Well, so much for that excitement.
But I see you. Oh.
But
Yeah, no.
It's supposed to be like me, like tiny with a nice little back,
It works.
like clear back.
Yeah, it works.
It works.
Oh, it did work?
Oh, well, it works for us, but Mr. Linux might not be able to do it.
I think that might have been the problem. I think that might have been the problem.
It works for all of us, but the guy who's actually running the recording, no, he doesn't allow to be cool things because he is so 2020 when it comes to his teams.
Hey, will someone throw a screenshot in the chat for me just so I can see it?
Yeah.
I'm just curious. I'm making sure we mess up your start of the recording so that you can then have to. Oh, that's beautiful. Oh man, I wonder how much it's going to mess up my presentation if I do this. All right. If there are any complaints as we go through, feel free to just post them in chat so I can ignore them, and I will gladly I'll gladly adjust. I've never done this before, and I like the personal touch, so I'm going to leave my video on.
Okay.
With that said, before Scott fully kicks me off, because I just want to talk over him for a minute, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute, put your video on, put a shirt on first, ask your questions. There are some interactive portions in here, so feel free to interact in the chat or in the video. Either way, I'm happy to. I don't want to be alone. That's all.
Yeah, I was already recording back before you had said, hey, before you start recording, I might trim it off. I might not. Who knows? But I just wanted to thank you, Jay, for jumping and on that grenade, because I had tried to get someone else and he said yes, and then I never heard back from him. And so whenever I reached out to you and you said yes, I was thrilled. So with that said, congratulations again on getting your MVP. Woo woo.
Thank you.
And with that, I will hand it over to you and turn off my camera.
Awesome. Well, thank you for allowing me to be your second fiddle, or second choice, or sloppy seconds, or however you'd like it to be. Everybody, pleasure to speak with you this evening. Again, not again. As you see on the screen, I'm going to present about modernizing IT and securing collaboration in M365. I'm going to try and focus on government requirements, but if you find me talking about stuff that's commercial only, feel free to, let's talk about it. Let's make sure people who are part of the conversation, either live or in the recording, get to understand the differences. I do focus on the public sector, so I try very carefully to not talk about commercial stuff. I'm also not going to talk about anything under NDA, not because I'm on an NDA for my MVP, but because I'm so new to the MVP, I don't actually have any of the NDA information. My name is Jay Leask. I am the Director of Federal Strategy for AvePoint Public Sector. Yes, it's a sales job, and no, I'm not a salesperson at heart. I've been in tech for 20 years. So I've done everything from, if you listened earlier, .NET development and PHP websites to BizTalk to SQL database stuff. I found myself on the front end and business side more often than not. So that's how I ended up in a talking position more than a coding position. Yeah. And again, thank you for comments on the MVP. I'm really excited to be part of that community as of this past week. So I'm going to go ahead and pause here in the chat, in the words, however you want to participate. What word best describes how day-to-day collaboration for your coworkers, employees, teams has changed over the last 15 months? Yes, Joe, front end is absolutely accurate. Jamie, I love Teams as the word because it definitely skyrocketed. Do not disturb mode. That's awesome. I know for me, we were actually Teams users to begin with. So for us, it was not wearing pants, but that's more than one word. What we often find is, crazy, inconsistence, a perfect word, constantly changing, difficult. Frankly, as much as organizations have attempted to make it as easy as possible, they've either made it too easy, which caused its own problems, or they've made it easy with big air quotes, but then locked it all down so it's not, in fact, easy. Great words that were added. So what I'm going to talk about today, leading towards that, is this concept of sustainable adoption and how you can secure your collaboration platform with this idea of sustainable adoption as you're doing it. We're going to talk about managing sensitive data. We're going to talk about partner collaboration or cross-agency collaboration. Again, don't have the NDA information on the cross-agency stuff they're doing, but I understand it's getting better and better. Hi, 3-year-old with no pants. Please go tell mommy that I said hello. We're going to talk about some concepts of centralized tenants and how that has changed things as people have moved from disparate farms to a centralized tenant. And actually, I'm not going to talk about that last bullet that much, but if you have questions on FedRAMP, I'm happy to have those conversations also. This all falls under the umbrella of sustainable adoption for me. Because if you do all of these things, sensitive data and cross-agency collaboration and centralized tenants, without this concept of how do we do it sustainably with an adoption mindset, then you're not actually enabling your users. You're just changing technology for technology's sake. And we're not alone in saying that. This is actually a Microsoft slide, piece for piece. If you look really carefully, you can see mine have these nice little triangles on the back. That's how you know it's not my slide. But Microsoft says that you have to have good governance to have great adoption. And as much as that's a really awesome marketing phrase, it's actually a pretty accurate statement. So this is something that we have focused on a lot, and that whenever, even before I worked for AvePoint, when I worked for Booz Allen, when I was a tech advisor and project manager for collaboration across some of the federal spaces, then it was always like, yeah, technology is awesome. What do you actually want people to be able to do? And then we'll pick the right technology to support that. And so that's really been my focus. Now, another quick question on the concepts here. When it came to moving your organizations to a cloud-based collaboration system, which many of you have done, perhaps not. And if you haven't, please put in the text why. Which of these options do you think is COVID? I don't know why I didn't put that as an option, Scott. Thank you. You're right. COVID is the primary driver for many government agencies' use of something like Microsoft 365 these days. Some had moved email, right? How many of you, feel free to raise hands or whatever. How many of you had moved email, but not moved like SharePoint Online or adopted Teams yet? All right, one. Beautiful. All right, put your hand down, Edmund. How many of you had not even touched M365 before COVID hit? Another one. All right, now somebody unmute and tell me, what were you doing when COVID hit? So I have an idea here. I can sit here all night too.
When COVID hit, thousands upon thousands of people agency all got sent home and discovered that they couldn't use a single Exchange 2003 server that was only rated to handle 300 users at any given time. Kaboom. So we jumped rather quickly.
I can't even imagine how quickly that had to be within a week. Like,
well, it was. So when I say jumped, I mean a month.
It was a month. Okay, that's
2
still
months.
For government. That is a week. That's massive. That's crazy. And I think I know where you're talking about. So that's even crazier. And anyone else want to provide where they were when COVID hit from a technology perspective, from a email or SharePoint or files perspective?
I used to teach high-level VTC on the JWIC side of the house. My boss came to me on Friday and said, guess what you're doing on Monday? I said, what? You're teaching MS Teams. You need to learn it this weekend. So I spent 16 hours one weekend going to YouTube, learning the process, and getting enough so I can get by on Monday.
Wow. That's fantastic. That is, I mean, it showcases just how quickly we had to change, right? You know, you've got an agency like Joe's moving to Exchange Online in under a month. And then you've got another one here taking their VTC trainers and moving them to Teams trainers in a weekend. It blew my mind to watch the government adopt as quickly as they have, and to see some of the things like the CVR stood up for the defense agencies, the teams in what was that was in GCC. To see how quickly those stood up, how quickly they were adopted, that hit about 1 million users regular use, which was insane. But the reason this is all important is because the very first thing they did, most likely, is they turned it on. And I'm glad to hear, you know, that they had some training for you wherever possible. But most of them, it was turn on and then react from a governance security perspective. It was, wait, I turned it on and that enabled what? One of my favorite stories is an agency with people over in Europe who were given Teams access, and they immediately started creating teams because it was open provisioning. They immediately started creating teams and channels with inappropriate names. And not to Scott would be very happy to give you a few examples of those names, I'm sure. And it's like, wait, why are people doing this? And so what we ended up with was this open provisioning system where people would start to lock it down. They'd either lock down who could create things, or they'd lock down what they could create, or they'd put in, you know, send us an email and we'll manually create it. Like, it just became this insane debacle of trying to manage things. So when we talk about sustainable adoption, we're talking about these 5 primary things. Self-service enablement. How do you enable the end users without locking them down and creating more of a roadblock than a system that they can utilize? But while doing that, how do you balance the right level of policy and control to make sure that while they're doing these things, they're doing it in a controlled, appropriate manner? Automation becoming the third point of that. So self-service, policy-based control, and automation to make sure that they're able to accomplish what they need to accomplish as quickly as they can while still meeting our corporate standards. And then the next 2 complement. How do you do ongoing management and governance, and how do you have some form of managed disposition? Because if any of you have worked in SharePoint for a long period of time, you know what it's like when we don't have some form of managed disposition, whether it's at the workspace level or at the content level. And Scott, that's horrifying. If you're not seeing the chat, Scott said our problem was buying only Office 365 licenses without any of the M365 security components. So then security people just turned stuff off. And that's exactly the kind of scenario I'm talking about. Just makes me sigh really heavily. Okay. So what do we want to talk about here? Just to further drive this point home, Microsoft 365 was specifically designed to enable people to do things as quickly as they could, however they needed to, and across the organization. So there are controls, there are native controls to help manage it, but the concept was open it all up. And in fact, I have a slide later that talks about it. Oh, can I quickly find it? This one. I have a slide later that talks about how open it is. As of February 21st, for example, I need to check to see that this is still accurate as I share it. But as of February 21st, when you added guest access, it was turned on by default. And that's what Microsoft is doing, because their goal is, how do we enable you to do what you need to do as quickly as possible? Not how do we secure it, but how do we enable it? And then we'll add the security on the back end for our administrative teams. So there is security capabilities, but it's not an afterthought. It's the let's secure what we have to secure, not let's secure by default. Feeling that approach. They tried doing compliance checks manually by adding security folks to every team. Man, so we have a customer um, who is not allowing people to be owners, they're using our tool to do it. So we have a solution in place that creates that owner, that placeholder account type owner. And then using our service catalog, they can do everything they need to do with the right approvals. But yeah, what I've heard is, people who do that by putting IT as the owner of everything. That customer I mentioned earlier with the inappropriate names as team names had 20,000 names. So you can imagine the process that they would have to go through if they were trying to put an IT person as the owner of every single thing that's created. In fact, I think they might actually run out of space from an owner's perspective, because you have some limitations there. So this one should be familiar with a lot of with you guys, and if you don't agree with some of these bullets, let me know in the comments. So from a legacy on-prem approach, you're generally creating long-term structured repositories, although in the government space, I will fully acknowledge that one of our most popular products was Content Manager, because especially in the DoD, you had the annual shuffling of your J structure or your whatever your organizational structure is. And when you do that, you of course shuffle the SharePoint site collections underneath it and subsites to match. But it's that concept of structured repositories, very hierarchical, a very defined permission structure that we're going to break later, broken inheritance, and then this concept of limited privilege to create access. With M365, you're going to have a much bigger mix of long-term and short-term workspaces. One of our government customers, their plan is for teams to have a 3-year life cycle, which is actually kind of long in my opinion, but it's their default. It'll last 3 years, and after 3 years, if it's not active, it's out. They're going to have a process to move records, and then the whole thing gets deleted. The other piece that I do a presentation, I've got a workshop coming up at the North American Collaboration Summit, which is that by default, Microsoft 365 sites are not hierarchical. So that concept that we're used to in SharePoint on-prem of top-level site collection, where you make someone a site collection administrator and they create this hierarchical structure underneath it that's 2, 3, 7, 15 sub-sites deep, that is not the default behavior in Microsoft 365. If this is not news to you, that's great to hear. If this is news to you, check out my Architecture is Flat presentation. There's a couple versions online to listen to a little bit more about how M365 flat architecture is actually a good thing. And then we get into this concept of highly privileged owners and members, which really blows people's minds when they first start using the tool. So we're 15 or so months into this. You can imagine that many of you have heard this, but when you create a team, you become the owner. When you become the owner, you set any of the capabilities for the team that your organization has enabled, and you're the site collection admin on the SharePoint site collection that's connected to it, which means all of those nifty little SharePoint things that you can do as an SCA, you can do simply as a business user who created a team. Scott, most of those presentations would be on YouTube, and I will try to actually, if you find a YouTube channel for Jay Leask, I'll try and dig up the link. I have a playlist called Jay in the Community, which might have one of those. I'll dig that up in a little bit for you. Long story short, you can hopefully see the differences, some of the difference between legacy and modern collab. I'm curious, I'll pause for a second. Anyone have any additional comments on the differences between how we've done things in the Microsoft ecosystem and how we have to do them now? Nobody? All right.
Yeah, it's a completely different model, right? It's yeah, so it's just completely different.
You know what?
Sorry, I've been looking through the Microsoft 365 Chicago channel to find the video, and it has an automatic video playing to tell me to donate. Gee, I wonder who did that. I wonder who set that up.
Yeah, it was definitely me. So anyway, yes, it's a completely different model, and Microsoft changed it they really started changing that in 2016. So this is not a new model today. It is newer in the last 5 years. With 2016, they started to introduce it with SharePoint Online. It became the model. And the reason they do that primarily is the simple fact that by doing this, when you create a plan, a group, a team, a site collection, it all has that same structure that we can build off of to connect everything. And it's actually a lot neater on that architectural side. But it does change how we do things. Now, from a sensitive data in this kind of a model perspective, which is what most of, oh, thank you, Joe, what most of the conversations government agencies are having once they start to realize what they have unleashed. Some of the primary issues are Office 365 gives owners a significant amount of privilege. I talked about that. You are not just the owner of your team, you are the site collection admin. Anyone can be an owner. Again, big deal. But bigger than that is any member can share content. And if do I have a document I can appropriately bring up? Here we go. These are some questions from a webinar I did last week called Watch Us Lose Microsoft 365 Data. It was a backup webinar. But if I hit share, anybody in our organization can do this. Now, there are some anybody in our organization can do nothing. That's what they can do. Upload pending. I'm not connected. That's the problem. That's beautiful. There we go. So anyone can come in here and say, the link I'm creating, I can share it with specific people. I can share it with people with existing access. I can give it to anybody in AvePoint. Or in fact, if it was turned on at the tenant level, I could give this to anyone with the link. And I can allow editing on top of that. And so this becomes the primary way of sharing things. That means you don't have broken inheritance because someone went to the document library and broke the inheritance by changing the permissions. You have broken inheritance simply because people created these amazing sharing links. So what do you do about that? How do you actually control all of that information? These are the kinds of conversations we're having with customers. And I'll dig into that here in just a few slides. Now, I've talked about teams, so I'm going to skip the details on this one, but you've got this concept of private versus public. Private being the way we create all of our teams. Actually, everything is a private team, but you can create public teams which anybody can join, which means they immediately become a contributor to it, which means they can immediately share that content. I showed you here on my screen already the permissions and how easy it is to create those things. Now, we talk about some of the default sharing options. In SharePoint site collection, when you go look at it, you can see here, these are your basic sharing permissions. You have site owners where site owners and members can share files. You have where site owners, members, and people with edit permissions can share files. And then you can lock it down, so only site owners. So there are some abilities to lock this down. But this is something you have to be proactive in considering because I believe this top option here is your default. You can also talk about how you do access requests and who receive those access requests. So some big important things you need to be considering and how do we lock this down. Scott, don't turn it off, Scott. Leave it on for people to be able to, share really sensitive information with people that shouldn't see it. I showed you here how easy it is with this option. Site owners and members can share files. You can see here that any member can go ahead and create this so that anyone in the entire tenant would be able to access it and edit it, and just how easy that becomes. Let's see here. So this is your anonymous link, which you'll hear a lot about. This is I don't know why there are so many arrows because they don't actually point to anything. I'll have to go back and edit this slide another time. But this is, again, just how easy it becomes to create those anonymous links that really become security concepts. And one of the problems, too, is not only are you doing this, but when it comes to reporting, like the model of Office 365 does kind of keep each site collection's information separate. which also means that your ability to report on the site collection for this team and the site collection for that team, or all of the site collections for this department, becomes pretty difficult natively. There are ways to pull it together. And if there weren't ways to pull it together, our product probably wouldn't exist anyway. But that is a big concern as you try to bring that all together and show across a department all of the things that are shared. Jamie, sorry to see you go, but thank you for joining us. All right. So what we've done is actually, it's special because we've done it, but it is not that special in the sense that technically we're not magicians. We've just created a combination of things. So one, we've created a report that rolls it all up. So from across your tenant, and yes, you can segment based on different types of information. We give you a report that shows you all of your anonymous links, for example. That is simply the permissions reports rolled up into one. The other thing that you can see here is we've got sensitive information types. So we are utilizing Microsoft's built-in sensitive information types to show you all of the sensitive information you have and combining it with the anonymous links, or not the anonymous links, the permissions reports. So we can show you all of your sensitive information of a particular information type next to all of the permissions that are tied to it to show you risk for what the risk is that it's being shared inappropriately. Now, if I pull up this screen here, you can see I've got a list of files, what it inherits its permissions from, what permission we're talking about. In this case, they're all an edit permission. Not really great from a demo perspective that they're all the same. When it was created, if there's an expiration date, what that expiration date is, if there are any blocks on downloading, and what the sensitivity level is. So you can see here, we're bringing all of that information together, the files, the permissions, the security around that, and the sensitivity information to show you what we're looking at. Now, if I go ahead and click through, you can see here as an admin, I can go ahead and manually set an expiration date on something that doesn't have one. I can even break the share and unshare it. Can we track guest user invites? Let me get to guest access in a little bit. Naveen, hopefully you'll like what I have to talk about there. So we can set the expiration date. We can look at our sensitivity levels, and we can actually change, or we can see why it is a particular sensitivity type level. So we can see in this case, it's a credit card number that's being exposed. And it gives us the ability to also go further and filter on a number of different things, such as where is it, what's it inheriting from, what type of permission is it, all of these kinds of things that you can filter on to really make sure you're seeing the report the way you want to see it. If in this case, I want to see everything a particular user has access to, I can actually click through and I can say, show me everything that this Muragon guy has within all of the workspaces. I don't know if everyone else is doing this yet, but for me, a workspace is an Office 365 group, a Microsoft team, or a SharePoint site. So we use the generic term workspace for any, or collaborative workspace for any of those. So what we did was we are now looking at a report that shows me everything this user, which could be an internal user or a guest user, has access to. And we're seeing the risk also. So there are 8 items with a high sensitivity that this person has access to. And if I click in, I can view all of the permissions for that, but I can also view the activities. So if I click the activities, I can see now we've taken the permissions report and the sensitivity data, and we've added to that the ability to see the actions this person has taken. So the concept here, again, using native technologies, what are my permissions for files, which is a really good piece of data that's in Office 365. Number 2, what are my sensitive information types? Now, I want to also point out that's not an E5 feature I'm talking about. The sensitive information types appear at a much lower, I think it's at the E3 they appear, and they actually get tagged. It's just not exposed to users. And so we're utilizing that default tagging to be able to show that. And then we're combining that with your activity reports to show where someone has accessed something with a high risk potential, a high sensitivity to showcase the risk and exposure. That's all great. But the other piece I would add to this, the other important piece I would add to this is, how do we get ahead of that and make sure it's not happening before it happens? And so we actually have built into this same capacity the ability to turn any of these searches into a rule-based policy to enforce that things like external sharing is turned off in a site marked a particular way, or that something with a high risk exposure, we don't have external sharing, not anonymous links turned on. So that kind of thing is something organizations need to be thinking about. And really, how do you do it? So we talked about those 3 types of reports that are all available, but rolling that up is going to take some massive configuration, because you got to pull that all from into one database and then be able to filter on it. And then I promised I would talk about competitors here. I honestly, I would welcome you to tell me what competitors I have, but we have not seen anybody who is pulling all of that information together in a commercially available, commercially off-the-shelf system. And seriously, do tell me.
Yeah,
Scott,
I just unmuted myself. I know of Control Point. I know of Control Point back to the 3-day SharePoint conference we had in DC back, I think it was like 2010. Yep. It was the first time I'd seen a desk for them, and they've changed ownership like 6 times since. That's the only other product that I'd really known about to handle permissions issues farm-wide. Yes. And I'll tell you, part of what brings me to looking for some kind of a product is we have a lot of people who are probably granting full control to people who have not sat through any of the training whatsoever. And if I could get a list of all the people that I had go through the training to say that they truly understood, how permissions were supposed to work, right, I would like to prevent anyone who's not on that list from having full control. Is that at all a possibility in either manual, if there's a PowerShell method of doing that, or through your tool?
That's a great question. Okay, so let me address this in the order you brought it up. So Control Point, you mentioned. Apricot is also mentioned here. I definitely recommend looking at them. They have some of the things we have talked about, especially around the permissions cleanup side. That competes with more of our DocAv or cloud management solution, which does give you the ability to do some cleanup there. Their governance is focused specifically or mostly around either provisioning or around the permissions management side. Great tools to have, but I have not seen either of them pull these kind of reports together. And thank you both for mentioning Naveen in the chat here, and Scott. As for the question about being able to look up, has this person done training? And if so, or if not, restrict them from being able to do something. That is not something that is handled through this tool set, but that is something I was literally talking to a customer about today. We have a customer in the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base, who said, when someone goes to create a team, we want to look up, and they want to put ITAR data in their team. We want to look up whether or not they have done the sharing of ITAR related data training. And if they have, then we'll go ahead and allow them to be a member of this controlled team. Same for SharePoint site collection. And I asked them, I said, so is there a list that I can look up against? Because if there is a list, then yes, one of our other tools, Cloud Governance, does have the ability to look up against a database or a SharePoint list through what we call a custom action. And that action can happen at the beginning of a service or at the end. So we have some ways to make that work in the best flow for the use. And if they are in the database, we can do specific things based on that. Or if they're not, we can restrict specific things based on that. And unfortunately, in that particular conversation, they are not that mature yet. So they're looking at something more manual, like kicking off a process for someone to manually do that research. But yes, if there is a list I can look up against, then I can restrict or permiss based on that. A more automated example that another DIB customer of ours, they for teams that require for teams that that have contract data, they need us to look up what contract is that on, and then with that information, they give us what contract that team is related to. And they then need us to look up against a list of, I think it's an external database in this case. We're looking up against this external database to see who are the contract program managers and accounting managers. And those people automatically get added to an approval process anytime someone not on that contract is added to the team. That was a really confusing. Can I get a hand raised if that made sense to people? Or like I don't know, a heart to make me feel better if it didn't make sense and you want me to try and explain that differently. Scott says no. Oh, bummer. Okay. Joe, I appreciate your hand raised. Okay, so I'll try one more time. So they're saying, look up in this external database who the approvers are going to be based on that's totally fair. I wish I had the workflow in front of me. They're saying if this team belongs to this contract, look up in an external database who the contract program manager and accounting manager is. And if I'm trying to add somebody who is not a member of that contract, so there's a separate lookup. In this case, it was an Active Directory lookup. If they're not in the contract, I have to get approval from those people. So it's not just an approval workflow, but it is an approval workflow that is dynamic based on the contract. So that's just to showcase, Scott, the ability to look up against a database and have different actions based on the information we're finding. I hope that makes a little more sense. And thank you for telling me I didn't explain it well. And Joe, thank you for being able to read my crazy, insane mind. So those are some of the things that we do. Now, actually, let me dig into that a little bit. Ooh, data in the term store. Nice. So data in the term store is a heck of a lot easier than a custom database. But that is good to know. Yes, that is something that we support also. So the next question I'm going to ask you guys, I'm going to shift gears a little bit, still related. I'm going to talk about external collaboration. So the question I want to ask you is, what's your strategy for collaborating with external users and partners? And I don't have here an option E, which is 0. Primarily because if you have an option E, your real answer is either email or purpose-driven tools. So I'd be curious to hear what some of our government friends here in the chat are using. Most of the customers we talk to end up being more email or purpose-driven tools. A number of them, especially on the ones that are still on the SharePoint on-prem, have that philosophy of creating user licenses or buying user licenses to support external users. And then some have started to adopt Microsoft Teams, but they've realized that there are some current concerns with bringing those users in, so they're a little bit more hesitant. 99% email and 1% Teams. Yes. I have 99 problems also, and email is all of them. So when we get into external collaboration, some of the concerns we hear are popping up here on the screen. I'm sure some of those make a lot of sense. Or to the first glance, you're making it easier to overshare. I don't trust people when sharing, especially external. My security team will never go for it. These are all valid concerns, but really If you're not letting them in, I promise you're already sharing externally. I'm not going to talk about classified data because that actually has much worse implications than, oh, they're going to slap my wrist. But I would bet anyone who says we're not sharing externally, you are. And it's scary because you have no control over it. Because when you do leave it to them, what you find is you don't know how they're doing it. Email, absolutely. Box and Dropbox, or I remember when I worked for Booz Allen Hamilton, we didn't have a good social collaboration system. And so they went to buy Yammer before it was purchased by Microsoft. And the Yammer team said, hey, great, we've already got a really vibrant community of Booz Allen users. We have 2,000 active users in our Yammer database sharing contract information and sharing, files. And Booz Allen went, well, clearly we're going to buy this so we can clean it up and lock it down. Maybe I shouldn't have said all that much. But yes, Scott, Booz Allen Yammer was awesome. And I remember the number of people who said, well, now that we actually own it, I'm going to stop using it. The point being, however, that if your security organization is taking that philosophy, they're saying we're never going to go for it. I would argue with them, all they're doing is allowing it in ways they can't actually provide any control. All right. So now that the fear is over, let's talk about the types of things you need to be thinking about when you are actually trying to consider this. So who do you need to collaborate and where? These are questions that we need to start asking from a business perspective. When we want to onboard new collaborative users, how do we want to control this? What type of process do we want to build around it? Do we want anyone to be able to invite somebody? And if they do, what kind of approvals do we want? And then, of course, what kind of monitoring and reporting do we need to have to know we are safe? Because if we don't have monitoring and reporting, I promise it's not going to work the way you think it works. All right. So I've already shared this with you. So just to kind of revisit this conversation, if you are not worried, you should have some concern. Because again, Microsoft is trying to make this as easy as possible. So the other piece I want to bring up here, or let's talk about how, I guess, is the right way to phrase this. So in Microsoft 365, there are two primary ways to do this. And it's important to understand the overlaps. There's teams and groups, which is guest sharing or guest access, excuse me, God bless it. Let me start that over. There's teams and groups, which is guest access. And there's SharePoint and OneDrive, which is external sharing. Now, they are starting to bring that together, but teams and groups use the guest model or Azure B2B. And again, SharePoint and OneDrive use the external sharing model. And the settings and controls do have some overlap, but they are very independent. And what do I mean by that? That's kind of me, actually. Let's move in and talk about that a little bit. So here are some of the controls you have for what guest users are permitted to do in Azure Active Directory. For example, who can invite people, can guests invite people, for example. Oh, and there's actually some domain specific things. So you can, they used to call it whitelisting and blacklisting. It's now approved list and blocked list. Very important to know, if you use an approved list, everybody is blocked by default. So in this case, we are denying invitations to these domains. So everyone is allowed except avpoint.com, which for an AvePoint demo environment is a pretty strong move right there. You could do the deny. You can do allow invitations sent to a specific domain. If this were checked, what I would be saying, I can't check a picture, Jay. If this were checked, what I would be saying is only the AvePoint domain and any subdomain would be allowed. And this is actually one of my co-hosts of the M365 Gov community call. They found that out the hard way because they had enabled allow for a couple of domains and realized all of a sudden it was turned off for everybody else. Right. Ooh, Scott, that's a great quote. I'm glad you pulled that up. That is from one of our case studies. Thank you. I didn't even ask you to share that. Now, when we look at SharePoint, going to the other side of the spectrum from guests, I want to point out this is the basic model of how you're controlling it. You have your most permissive where anyone can share things, and your least permissive where only people in your organization can share things. And as you slide this up and down, which I can't do in a demo, or I'm sorry, which I can't do in a picture, it's important to note that if you move SharePoint, you are restricting OneDrive. But if you move OneDrive, you are not restricting SharePoint by default. So you pull this slider down and this one pulls to match. You pull this slider down and this one stays more open. It's also good to know that you have some file and folder things by saying who gets the ability to do this. Right. Now, as we continue to go through screenshots from hell, in the SharePoint side, users can share with. This allows you to get into the depth at the service level. So we can say anyone new and existing users, existing guest users only, and only people in your organization. So this is actually important because you're saying if you're already a guest when I set this, then I can share with you. But I can't, I'm sorry, but I cannot share with someone who is added as a new guest next week. Continuing down this process, again, just to show you how much you have to be thinking about, can I let users add new guests to the organization? That goes to that setting of new and existing, etc. And then one step further, let's look at groups here for a moment. Office 365 groups, let's let group members outside your organization access group content. And group owners can add outside people from outside your organization to their groups. Notice this is Office 365 groups, not SharePoint, not Teams. If I go back into the SharePoint site collection here and I try to share, you can see that this external user is restricted. But if I click through to the SharePoint site collection, now that it's enabled at the tenant level, I can actually enable it at the site collection level. And I've gone through this, and it really is this much of a pain. When I was doing Office 365, sorry, the M365 Chicago conference and trying to share things out with speakers, and realizing that it was enabled at the tenant, but not at the group, but not at the site, it becomes disastrous. And of course, what kind of link can I create? I can do a direct link with specific people. I can do any anonymous, but internal, and anonymous global. Again, just showing that incredible level of depth that you have. And let's go one step further in OneDrive. Notice now we're in OneDrive and we can say what kind of sharing can we have? Well, let's allow sharing to authenticated external users and anonymous access links. Man, and what can they do? They can view or they can edit, again, setting those default permissions, not following the least permissive model that Scott keeps suggesting. And again, in OneDrive, like SharePoint, you've got this drop-down cape. Oh, I already described this. Why is this here again? This is here again for a reason. And I don't remember why. When I'm doing this, I then have to go in and turn on the advanced settings to allow it. You can see how crazy it is. All right. Of course, in Teams, in the Teams Admin Center, look, I just turn it on and it's on for all teams. Okay, in all seriousness, like someone unmute and tell me, if this is new to you, is this something that looks easy to manage and understand and configure at the appropriate levels, or does this look like the kind of thing that your organization is just gonna least permissive restriction, as Scott has said?
Well, I mean, to be honest, it's easy enough to go through the clickety-click, right? That the configuration itself is easy. The decision making over, whether or not things should be on or off, is always debatable because, and this isn't necessarily because I came from the intelligence community.
Right.
But because I'm definitely one of those who, says I have a responsibility to provide, not just, that we had to get rid of that paradigm shift of need to know, and, so that we don't have another 9/11. But so I don't like it when people overly restrict their sites and,
Right.
And whatnot, because I think that's just really to hide your sausage making because you are ashamed of your work. But whenever I think, business specific, there is no legitimate reason that I can think of why, at least with my client, that we would want to share things outside of the organization itself.
Sure.
The potential for PII loss, I believe, is just too high. So we have lots of filters in place to prevent people from accidentally emailing bad things. I think that the biggest threat is always, your own users just doing dumb things. And so I don't want them to accidentally share, because they see that share button, they see social media, they think they're just sending out the link, and it doesn't matter how many times you teach them otherwise. They think they're just sharing a link, and instead they're giving away permissions, and it's very scary.
Yeah. Now, Scott, one thing you mentioned that that's particularly interesting to me is you're right. Setting this initial configuration up is the easy part as compared to the decision-making process for actually deciding should this be allowed. Now, let's say at the tenant level, you have decided we're going to allow it, but on a case-by-case basis. So you have set up the tenant restrictions to allow this to happen. I'm curious what your thoughts are on how you would, did I click? I didn't mean to. How you would then take that complicated manual decision and then go through each team as it's created, or each site collection as it's created, to then set the right permissions at those levels, especially with the number of available areas that this can be set. Is that still the easy part? Do you think?
I really think it's going to be kind of blanket, at least with my organization.
That's fair.
It'd be different if I was currently supporting another agency that's in the intelligence community, where, DIA wants to share with CIA and NSA and FBI, and, they have a legitimate reason to do that. The client I'm supporting right now, I cannot see really any instance where they have a need to share with another organization that kind of information from our SharePoint stuff, or from Teams or whatever. I don't. Maybe at the extremely high levels where, agency heads talk to other agency heads, but they don't use technology anyway. They just walk into meetings and VTCs and stuff. So I don't see how anyone's going to be like, yes, Commissioner, you should have full control of this site.
Yeah,
that's scary.
I'm not going to disagree with that statement.
The boss of your organization should not have full control, just saying. And that goes for all the lower level offices. The GS-15 in charge should not have full control.
Yeah.
His job is not that of the web administrator for your office.
Yep. Joe, I see you've been breathing into the microphone.
Sorry. No, I'm going to tee up so you can spike it.
Okay.
Because with another, so no, this is not easy to figure out for one, even for a small, close-knit team of people who are all working on the admin centers together and who all agree on what they want to do. Now imagine each admin center is controlled by a different person who doesn't even work in the same team or subdivision or division of the IT department.
Right.
You guys get the Exchange Admin Center. You guys get the SharePoint Admin Center. Those guys over there get the Teams Admin Center, and that guy over there gets the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, and no one knows who has the Azure Center.
Yeah.
And they're changing things on a semi-regular basis, and those switches in one affect the switches in others. And that is very difficult to manage.
Yeah. So I'll go out of order a little bit because that is a really good point. So we have a lot of conversations with customers who, in the past, each department had their own farm, or each division, or however the organization is set up, bureau, etc. And what they found is now that they're in a central tenant, actually, let me show this one. Now that they're in a central tenant, what they found is everybody has, at a service level, the same permissions if they're a SharePoint service admin. But that means if you're a SharePoint service admin here, you're also a SharePoint service admin here and here. And the division, I gotta update this slide because this one has some funky carryovers. But if this is Division A, where they had their own farm and they have their own reporting, their own farm, their own content, their own permission manager, here, if they're a permission manager, they're a permission manager all the way across. They're a service manager all the way across. So what we do, what our philosophy looks at, is we actually create a combination of role and security trimming in an abstraction layer. So we don't give them SharePoint service admin in M365. We give them the permissions in our tool to make sure that when they are managing SharePoint permissions, it's being combined with a scope of content. So that we can say, hey, you are an administrator of the policy enforcement or the management capability, but you're also limited to these site collections. So it's almost like giving them site collection admin, but we're giving them the blanket service and then checking the site collections they're allowed to do that in. Now, that is fine. It sounds a lot like making someone a site collection admin for each one. And so we go one step further, and we have dynamic object registration so that you can say, I got to read this slide as I go because I don't actually know what's written on it. I know the concept here. So we can say, here's a container. We're going to call it a department A. We're going to call it finance. And we're going to say that if your title includes finance and we're in site collection, perfect. So if the title of the includes finance and the primary admin is this person, then it automatically goes here. Now, that's not a particularly great example. So let me dig a little bit further. If we are looking at SharePoint sites, you can see any of these fields. Any of these fields can drive the metadata we're looking at to create that collection. So I can create a collection of sites. I can call them finance, and I can look at a custom property in the property bag of that container. Let's call it a division custom property that's being stored. So if you have a provisioning system that sets property bag stuff, we're great, right? I can say, show me the department. If the department equals finance, then add it to the finance container, which then when I go back up here, I can actually do this instead of at the site collection level, I can do it more automatically and say anything in that finance container becomes the third piece. So not only are you an administrator with policy enforcement capabilities, but we're going to scope it to that container. Did that make sense? Joe, did I flail too much and miss the spike? I think I did. All right, I got a thumbs up. Thank you, Naveen. So that's something that we're looking at to combine the service capability with the scope of content. Now that's one piece of the puzzle. The other piece of the puzzle is how do we do this more automatically? So I talked about how you scope the permissions that Joe had mentioned. How do we set a policy so that all of the things that we shared here, all of these settings, and settings outside of external sharing, any kind of setting related to a team, a group, a site collection, whatever. How do we set automatically what can happen? And so our tool, what we've done is we've built this policy capability to combine the self-service with that balance of control. And so in this case, we're doing external sharing. We're setting up a policy for external teams, external public facing teams, so for guest access, and we're turning on those capabilities. So we're turning on group and team owners can add people outside the organization. In this case, we're not checking people who are not already in Active Directory, but you can enable that. We're setting unique sharing permissions and saying at what level can they share. So this gives us that granularity from a policy perspective. Now, to go a step further, we're adding conditional approval processes so that we can say, if you meet a particular criteria, we will grant you this permission. Scott, to kind of go back to your example, I'm not going to give your senior leadership permission to change these settings, but I am going to grant them the ability to go to a self-service catalog and request that this be created. And if they meet that right criteria, then say, all right, we'll do it with the conditional approval. We'll meet this conditional approval and then turn these settings on for you. I hope that made sense. All right. And I'll come back to that comment.
Makes sense.
Yeah, cool. So when we talk about this, when we have these conversations, we're talking about targeting your capabilities based on different needs. So we're saying, hey, Department A, finance, you're not going to have external sharing turned on, but Department B, this is the Department of Partner Collaboration. I'm sure we all have one of those departments. We're going to allow you to have external sharing across the board with 12-month access. But notice that we're going to require you to recertify your members every 6 months. And this is the kind of stuff that we're enabling that you can't do natively. Natively, you can manually set up the sharing capabilities. You can do some things on the expiration and retention policy, but note that lifecycle for teams is teams wide. So if you turn it on, all teams follow this. The exception being that you can say all teams follow this, but if it's active, don't do it, which is great, except if it's active and they're breaking policy, then we're not capturing that information. And so we're creating a system that allows different divisions to have different services, but also specialized services. So that you have some different capabilities. The blanket 7-year retention is a great conversation for another day. I have many thoughts on that one. All right. So if we, just to pull this all together, if we create a guest user request, this is where we go in. We say this is our tenant. We've got the ability to build in some things like the primary contact is by default the person requesting it, and we can say it's read only or editable. So if I'm an admin, an executive admin, and I am requesting this on behalf of my manager, the department owner, I can actually edit this if that permission is given to me in the service design. You can see here we've set a renewal profile. We haven't talked about renewal profiles, but that's that concept back here. Where how often should it expire and what kind of recertification should we have? And by the way, retention and expiration here, Scott, we can do things other than delete. We can make it read only or remove all the permissions so it's archived, but it still exists. So you're still meeting that 7-year policy. If I click through, here's what a renewal profile looks like. A lot of things we can do, like how often do you want the renewal to happen, all the way down to the everyday process. That one might be a little extreme, but just to give you some options. What happens? What happens if it goes overdue? So is it overdue if they haven't done it for 7 days? And if so, we have some capabilities to then chase that down or go up a level in maybe Active Directory to their manager and say, hey, they have an active task that hasn't been filled out. Going through, here's an example of what happens with that process. So this is a guest user, Tom Kaczynski. The contact for Tom Kaczynski is Ray Hill. So we have a person that has been assigned as the owner of Tom Kaczynski, not an admin, just a business user who has said, I'm the reason Tom is here. When I click on this person in our tool, I can see all the workspaces Tom has access to. I can see if we've captured the information, what's their title, who invited them. In this case, I invited them, but it may be, my admin invited them for me. Another piece here is I can do this going forward, but I can also import all the existing guests. All right, so here we go. We've got Tom Kaczynski as a confirmation. It's a renewal. We clicked renew the guest user. This is the process that any business user goes through when they are assigned a renewal. They can reassign it to someone else. They can click yes, they want to do it. You see the sites that are the workspaces, in this case, all teams, because we're talking about guest renewals. I can see the contacts for that team. Man, this thing cruises through, doesn't it? I can actually tell it to remove them from these teams so they will no longer have access while leaving them in others. And I can submit that. That would leave them with access to those two, or I can just flat remove them. So they are no longer a guest in our organization. John, thanks for joining us, man. All right. So you can see here how we go through that process, just kind of wrap it all together. The other thing that we have, and I'm not really getting into it tonight because of time and concept, is this is at the guest user level, but during a workspace recertification, the owner of the workspace, let me rephrase that, the contact for the workspace. So not a technical owner, but the person deemed the business contact gets the same process. And for the workspace, they see all the members that belong to it. I would be more than happy at another time. If anyone wants to see that, hit me up on social media and I'll walk you through what I'm talking about. The other piece is like, how do we proactively monitor and make sure people who shouldn't have access don't have access? So this is an area of our policies tool where we look for ghost user detection. These are people who have been added and have access to things they shouldn't have. And we can say, what happens when we find a guest, someone who's in Active Directory but not having access, someone who doesn't have current access to a site or a workspace, and we can actually remove them pretty nice and cleanly and send notifications out about that. And we can remove people who have been inactive also. So the ability to go through and identify those inactive users. Again, how do you do this natively? I welcome some thoughts on what you can do. I know there's some Active Directory cleanup things, and I know there's PowerShell capabilities for this. It's a matter of the PowerShell gives you some really strong capabilities to develop how to do the cleanups, how to do approvals, maybe with a Power App or something like that. You might have some way to submit, but these are all different pieces that you'd have to pull together to be able to accomplish that. Okay, I've already gone through the AOS side. So just one more piece of information to kind of bring this all together is at the workspace level from a reporting perspective. So this report, let me see here, just before I jump in, this is a workspace report. These are also, okay, got it. So this is our workspace report. So I've talked about guest users this whole time. This report exists for workspaces and for guest users. So our workspace report looks at workspaces that have been brought into management or system, whether they're created here or they are imported from existing spaces. So if you have your own provisioning process, we can actually run like a daily import job to grab anything that was created in your provisioning process and then bring it into management in our system. The workspace report lets me see what phase is it, if there a renewal pending or something that's, what was the word we used earlier? Overdue. You can see what type of space is it. So a site collection, a team, a group. Of course, the URL, what policy does it follow? So these are public teams. Here we go, a private team. Here we go, a guest group team. So a Microsoft team with guest users. Who's the admin, the owner, the data owner? This is that concept of a contact, a business owner who says, I own this, but I'm not given technical privilege, and a primary and secondary in that case. And with this, with this report, that animation's got to go. With that report, you can look at any metadata in the property bag, whether it is lifecycle information, custom information you're collecting and storing, and be able to say, show me all of the things with this office. Show me all the workspaces that belong to this particular office, and I can build reports off of that. So I can build policies off of that. Similarly, when I click into it, I can see all of that information about the workspace, and I actually have the ability to view the timeline for it to see when was it created, when it was renewed, by whom, who was a task assigned to, and all of that information. And the last piece, of course, what's the policy associated with that? So the security requirements, how it's set up, can guests get in, etc. And I'm only showing you the workspace report, which is a little bit confusing because I spent the whole time talking about guests, but that exact same capability is available at the guest user report level. Naveen, can we also invite and track guest users, or is it just the renewal? So would you mind coming off mute and clarifying what you're looking for there, Naveen?
Hey Jay, hey, sorry. Hi. No, I was just so I think you're showing like how we can renew the guest access for a workspace, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So I was just wondering, like initially when we were trying to add like guest users to a workspace or a team, if there is a way to send them an invite from
Mhm.
the AirPoint and just track it, if they accepted
Yes.
the invite and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, so we do. So our service catalog, if I go back to that self-service concept we talked about, you can create a service catalog with any number of services, change ownership, change permissions, change metadata, create a new workspace, retire a workspace, archive a workspace just for Scott. And then, of course, to invite new guest users, you have those capabilities as well. So you have that capability to create service catalog and scope the services to specific people or people based on roles or other Active Directory values, and then track all of that. So it's not just the renewal, it's the whole service catalog experience. Thank you for asking.
Hey, Jay, Scott here. To help me understand workspaces, I might have just missed you saying it. That's your abstraction layer where it's any combination of site collections or sites, or what?
A workspace for AvePoint is any SharePoint site object, so a site collection or a site. It is, although site collection is where most of the governance happens for Office 365.
Yeah.
It is any Microsoft team, and it is any Office 365 group.
Okay, so it's just a middle layer that you guys have created. Okay.
It's just a word to summarize all of those things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's good because one of our policies is just because of the insane nesting that we had found on some sites,
Yep.
or site collections, we have the ability to turn subsites off.
Oh,
so
okay.
Everything is going to be a site collection, and
Yes.
by managing hub sites, it's much easier to say, okay, prior to the reorg, these are all of the subsites, that are
Right.
actually site collections. And then if someone moves because of reorganization, we just remove them from that hub site and put them into a different one.
Yep.
So much easier than working with ugly subsites.
Yes. So I mentioned my flat architecture stuff. Joy, Apple, and I talk about it more than I probably would like to. And that is something we talk about all the time, is how much easier life is when you're at the site collection level, instead of the site level, and then you can use things like hub sites to connect things. And then, oh, look, we're having an organizational restructure. So now something at the J64 belongs in the J4. That's potentially a completely inappropriate example. But now I just changed the hub site that this is attached to, and everything's fine. So I'm with you completely on that one. All right. Any other questions, clarifications, comments on how easy it could have been if I just did it natively? And I really do welcome that feedback, because I want to make sure that any examples I'm giving are accurate. Joe and the I Love Hubs.
I just really wish I knew of a way to limit the ability for anyone to get full control.
Yeah.
So
what?
That would be like, maybe I just add them to, because there was a PowerShell script I ran 3 years ago that I was using so that not everybody could willy-nilly create teams and groups and stuff, but some people could. And so there's an AD object I'd made, put some people into it, ran some PowerShell, and ta-da.
Yep.
I can't remember what that was exactly, but if I could do some kind of a AD security group and just add people as they've passed the training, and just say if they're not in there, even if you add them to the owners group, they don't have full control.
So that's a really interesting idea. There's a couple of responses I would have to that. One, we do have reactive policies that if someone is added as a site collection administrator, we can actually remove them. So we can do that kind of cleanup. It's not immediate, so they do get that permission for a little while. And two, same thing with owners. With that DIB customer I mentioned earlier, we don't actually make anybody an owner. Everything they do is through the service catalog. So they get permissions through a service catalog item, like I want to change the name of my group. Well, I've got a service item that lets them change the name, but we can then still control what they're doing. So if they try to change it to ice cream, and ice cream is a restricted word, or fuck off, then it won't let them do it. Or maybe it will let them do it with an approval from, the cybersecurity team. Yeah. Natively. I like the concept you were going for, though. I especially like the idea of, and this is one of the things we talk to our customers about, is if your Active Directory is clean, you can do so much more. And what I mean by that is if you're using Active Directory groups, you can assign a group to something, and all of a sudden they get to do stuff because they've been added to the group, and you added them because they passed a test. Woohoo! Or with our DIB customers, they do things like one of our DIB customers, they created a field in Active Directory for foreign person, and they've identified that field allows us to then programmatically say, if you have a true value under foreign person and someone tries to add you to an ITAR site, we can go through a process to get a manual approval automatically. So it's not a manual. Someone looks up and says, is this person a US citizen? They actually do it the other way and say, if they're not, okay, now we kick off for a cybersecurity approval, for an export control approval, et cetera.
That would be good, because I know that I have some visa holders working for my organization.
Yep.
So that'd be useful. I don't know if we have anything in our current AD schema to identify foreign or not.
Yep. Yeah, it's all about how can we utilize a system like Active Directory and the group structure to figure those sorts of things out. Yep. All right. And any other questions on the evening? And first of all, thank you everybody for sticking with me for, what is this, 80 minutes of my non-radio voice.
Yeah. 80 minutes you will not get back, sir.
That is very true.
But I really appreciate you jumping in and giving us the session. It's illuminating, and it's always nice to hear from someone who's been in the trenches trying to fight the fight you know, because I find that, you know, the only people who like change are dirty babies, and they too will put up a fight. So.
Yeah, man. No, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. If anybody has any questions, either from the chat room or if you're watching the recording, please by all means reach out to me. I'll pull my slide up again just to kind of, I should have done that to end us. Feel free to reach out to me at any time. j.leask.com is a really difficult website name to remember. But you can see I've got a number of different ways you can reach out to me, and I'd be more than happy to answer questions and have, frankly, just have a conversation. I don't need a pitch software. If you want to ask me questions, I'll point you in a direction to hopefully get the answer you're looking for.
Yep. I'll add the same information to the description of the YouTube video whenever I upload it.
Cool.
At this point, I'm going to hit the button to stop the recording.
Awesome.